Hello, fellow tea drinkers. Welcome to Oversteeped. Today, we'll be talking about why small details have big impacts. Predominantly, I'm going to be going over the difference between using details to add warmth and humanity to a scene, and when too many details cause needless clutter. I'll also be using examples from popular works to highlight when these details are done well, so like from Hayao Miyazaki's Howl's Moving Castle, or from Harry Potter, the entire series, but as well as examples when their absence creates a void of sorts that hurts the narrative. So, this is a difficult subject to pin down, because it's often not something that's glaringly obvious about any given scene. When it's done right, these details add a quality to their narrative that's unmistakable. So far what I've described is incredibly vague, and surely there's a degree of confusion to be expected regarding a topic as blurry as this. Best to give an example as a sort of benchmark or starting point for what we're discussing. So if you're not familiar with Howl's Moving Castle, I suggest you stop watching this video immediately, as you've done yourself a huge disservice for having lived as long as you have without having seen it. Once you've done that, you'll probably need no further primer on this topic, because it does it expertly, what other works usually fail at, which is scene dressing. So every room in Howl's Moving Castle is uniquely furnished, decorated, inhabited, to the point where the film feels less like something created by humans and more like something real, something tangible. The details add immersion, they add believability, they add evidence of the mundane, things like food, clothing, household tools, etc. And this is in order for the real magic of the narrative to shine. Too often do writers forget to ground their characters in fantasy settings or the like, with things that remind us of their humanity. How many science fiction novels or films contain lifeless scenes with clinical-looking rooms devoid of things real people interact with, require, or just enjoy? I can list examples of this, although they're too numerous to really go into practical detail with. But a good example of when this is done really badly is if you're familiar with the Star Wars prequel trilogy. There are a lot of scenes where characters are just walking and they're talking in blank or sparsely decorated like hallways, or they're sitting down in just some backdrop of some space setting where the windows might be open and there might be a lot of clutter in the environment. There might be like a lot going on, but there isn't a lot of characteristics that add personality to the room. There's not a lot of detail that's being paid to the actual settings themselves. I call this like generic set dressing, where somebody might think, okay, yes, we're going to be in this specific setting. Well, let's just say we're going to a school. Okay, what do schools have? They have desks. That's it. We're not going to do anything special to the desks. We're not going to show how each person's desk might be a bit different. We're not going to have certain characters have certain unique items to them. We're not going to have certain characters lacking certain items that you would expect. And that's also something that should be paid attention to. But, and I'm not the only person to point this out, but the Star Wars prequels were cluttered in certain scenes, but they weren't filled with detail that actually added anything to the scene, and often it just felt void of really any personality, and it did have a lot to do with the blocking. It had a lot to do with obviously the writing in general. There was a lot going on here, but one of the main issues is that it you might not, if you took a still frame of any scene that I'm describing, you might not know the difference between something that's done well and something that's done poorly, just by looking at one frame, because there's no context there. But as a collective, you can watch these movies and you'll understand what I'm talking about. there needs to be intentionality behind the items, the things that the characters are interacting with, or in general how the scene is dressed. And with the prequels, most of the time it's just so generic, but yet so cluttered that it lacks this sense of care. It just looks so unintentionally messy, and yet somehow still devoid of any sort of personality. Whereas with Howl's Moving Castle, like I said, if you haven't seen it, please go watch. But every room is brimming with personality, and the characters not only exist in these spaces, and our eyes are able to take in the detail, even passively, but they also interact with the things in these spaces, which is great. It adds that sort of tangibility. It adds that sort of realistic quality that's necessary, especially with a fantasy, or even more so with animation, because of course this is a completely crafted world, right? But they don't interact with these fantastic devices or extraordinary items. Of course those can sometimes occur, but the thing that's really prominent in many Ghibli works is that they're interacting with common things like food. More often than not, there are scenes that include characters just sharing a meal together, and it's not done in a sort of a cold, sort of neat and beautiful, I'll call it, way where everything is sort of precise. There is a messy, sort of deliberate nature to how flawed everything is, and that's very refreshing, and it's something that really grounds the world. Fantasy needs that ground. Fantasy needs to be grounded. Sci-fi needs even more than that to be grounded, because often there's a sort of lack of rustic and grittiness with these sorts of stories already. Of course, some are done well, but these details are 100% necessary in order to lend to that believability and that tie that the reader has, or the audience has, to that kept humanity, right? So sometimes these messier details, these like half-drunk teacups on tables, jackets that are like folded over chairs, notebooks with like little post-its that are stuck between the pages, they all say something about that space, that room. These little things tell you a lot about the characters who use them, and in turn, the items also tell us about what kind of world we're in as well. Howl's Moving Castle isn't the only piece that showcases a world so lived in and inviting that the audience can't help but be immersed. Ghibli films are notorious for paying special attention to these details, but they're not the only source where you can find a good example of this done well. Within Harry Potter, the entire series, there's special care done to events like holidays, even birthdays, even just simple things like eating a meal in the Great Hall. The way that the different characters are showcased with different items of clothing, and even just how people prefer to keep their rooms, their carriages, their trunks, things like that. Even the teachers have this going on as well at the school. Every classroom is uniquely decorated, and it suits the character's personality. It suits the way that they live and sort of their the way that they handle their class as well. And this is especially present when each book there's a different Defense Against the Dark Arts professor who's introduced as the position is continuously open by the end of the last book. But of course, that classroom is just completely different every time. And these little details, you could argue, don't necessarily have to be there. And it perhaps you might be considering, well, of course you're going to need certain details for certain scenes. That's what setting is about. That's how to describe things to differentiate between different places and characters, and that's understood. But there is some sort of difference, I find, between a writer who understands just getting the basics or a foundation of laying a setting out versus the care given to the small details that are indicating something about a person's personality, about the setting in a specific way. And a lot of writing advice actually gets in the way here. More often than not, new writers are advised to trim down, to cut out, revise, limit, and above all, keep it simple. This tends to be said over and over again, whole cloth, to aspiring writers without much nuance. And for the most part, it's a safe piece of advice to give. Rambling certainly isn't going to get you published. We can't all be Tolkien. But what tends to happen is that writers prune down so much unnecessary details out of their narratives that the scenes end up feeling bland or confusing. Entire rooms start blurring together. The passage of time becomes unclear. Characters shift from one scene to the next. They don't eat, they're never sleeping, they're never doing anything other than speaking or taking action. And perhaps a scene where main characters share a meal together isn't necessary to moving the plot forward, but I would firmly argue against its removal. Cutting out too much detail sterilizes a narrative. Slowing things down lets your audience appreciate the details, and the details lend to immersion. Immersion is what separates a story that captures the reader's attention from one that's weak and forgettable. Great characters can save an average plot, but even compelling narratives with unique characters can sometimes not be enough to hold our interest in a story when the scenes are bare bones and forgettable. It's impossible to provide a use case for every type of detail a story might contain. Every scene will require special consideration, and not all will need the same level of care. An exhaustive list would be near infinite and frankly not worth the effort, as it's not something that can be determined ahead of time, but rather something that's unique to the narrative at hand. What needs to be understood is that details add a sense of normalcy and familiarity in an otherwise unfamiliar space. Crafted worlds feel more grounded when the characters are shown sharing a meal together, or doing chores, going about their morning routine, or simply sleeping after a long day of hard work. Cutting out unnecessary words, merging similar characters, or withholding excess information is essential. No one would argue otherwise. But there is a pervasive mindset in the writing industry that takes this concept of brevity too far. Sometimes absence of a thing is felt just as much as the thing itself. I certainly notice, and I think your readers do too. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe for more content like this. As for me, I'm going to finish this half-drank cup of tea. Until the next time, thank you and good night.